The left hates racial minorities. They are racist, not just to white people. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and just today I had a run-in with a non-binary communist-identified leftist on Twitter who has been tweeting at me a lot recently, and one of the things that I have taken to doing in situations like these is to say, "Leave me alone, racist," for several reasons, part of which I explain in the video shown here. Ultimately, what I didn't clarify all that well in that video, and certainly can't easily articulate on Twitter, was a thorough rebuttal of what this non-binary identified leftist said in response, which was to strawman my position, assuming that I was merely talking about racism against white people, which is the go-to thing that people point out when they call the left a bunch of racists for obvious reasons. However, I don't think that's at all where it ends, and overall, nor do I think that it ends with the soft bigotry of low expectations, which assumes black people need endless support or they'll never succeed in any way at anything. I think that far leftist, identity politic obsessed, postmodern, neo-Marxist, intersectional feminist types are racist towards literally everybody in all sorts of super specific ways, and I think that they are this way because their entire worldview revolves around seeing things with a racialized lens and acting upon that. Sorry, not sorry. But you can't sit around and honestly think that the ideology that seeks to penalize Asian Americans with affirmative action isn't racist. So, how did the left become so racist? Why do they say such ridiculously racist things as...
The reality is that race in the United States operates on a spectrum from black to white. Doesn't mean that people who are in between don't experience racism, but it means that the closer you are to white on that spectrum, the better off you are, and the closer to black that you are on that spectrum, the worse off you are.
Once upon a time, when I was maybe in middle school, I saw a movie or on television, a black character explain to another racial minority, probably another black person, "To white people, there are only two races, white and non-white." This seemed completely strange to me because I had a Japanese aunt that was never treated at all the same as my family treated most black people, for example. And we all know that the stereotype of white guys frequently dating Asian women didn't come from nowhere. Thus, being that I knew immediately that this statement was untrue, my childhood instinct was to assume, though I didn't have the word for it, that this was some sort of projection from the black community, if anybody thought that. Because when I started thinking about it, it really did seem like many or most of the black people I knew at my 80% black middle school felt themselves that America was divided into two races, black and non-black. Of course, I was in far leftist Seattle, which has factions of radical black supremacist Marxist groups like Uhuru, which is Gazi Kotso's thing, and also the Black Panthers.
Y'all, it's me, Gazi Kotso, the cutest and your favorite revolutionary. Y'all know that I am a big fan of The View. I love watching problematic white nationalist liberals argue with a problematic white nationalist conservative. Oh my God, it's so different. So I want to discuss this episode that I saw about them talking about, the Trump and Korean deal with my comrade Kim Jong-un. Hey, Kim Jong-un, it's me, Gazi. I don't know if y'all have internet.
From my memory, for the most part, black people don't act like that so much in New York City, where people mix fairly well and capitalism tends to thrive. But it's super easy to find that attitude in the further far leftist San Francisco Bay Area, especially in Oakland, birthplace of the Black Panthers, where to a lot of people, if you weren't black, you weren't fam. This is also where Black Lives Matter was born, of course. Thus, it doesn't take a Peter Thiel to figure out that there had to be a bit of an origin story regarding the dramatically racialized worldview of black people in far leftist areas like Seattle, Oakland, and from what I've heard, apparently Chicago and other such places. So, here's what I've pieced together after some reading. First, you should keep in mind that the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism does not have a huge impact on the United States, despite what many people would claim, as there was already a communist party here, and it literally always focused on identity politics, due mainly to the fact that there was an African American population with its own specific grievances in the United States. You see, due to the pre-Cold War American communists' worldview of trying to help the oppressed and the disadvantaged, and the fact that there wasn't hardly any Asian Americans in the nation, a minuscule proportion of Native Americans, and the fact that Hispanic wasn't even an official category at the time, the United States Communist Party ended up paying a lot of specific attention to the oppression of Negroes, as they would have put it. Even if you go through history books written by leftists themselves, such as this one I keep talking about called Red Feminism, they'll tell tales of numerous instances of the Communist Party of the United States coming down hard against what they called white chauvinism, which they were vehemently against, as white chauvinism kept Negroes from joining the Communist Party, and they always wanted more members. This led to numerous different organizers embracing black identity politics before the Cold War, and even what could best be described as the original proto-intersectional feminist historical figure, a black female member of the Communist Party who joined the youth faction in the 1930s, a woman named Claudia Jones, who they wrote an entire book about called, get this, Left of Marx. And she based a lot of her work around the notion that she was triply oppressed as a poor black woman. That being said, if you go through the history books, the actual work regarding race, class, and all of that intersectional stuff was literally around as far back as the 1930s and developed through the 1950s. But I will make an entire video about all of that. It was in the Communist Party. However, at the end of World War II, which the United States Communist Party supported going into, as they hated Hitler as he was the enemy of Stalin and they supported Stalin, at the end of World War II, the Cold War began, and numerous domestic communists were arrested after being discovered to be Soviet agents, and everybody else went undercover with their Marxist beliefs, which contemporary leftist scholars admit to if you bother to read their boring books. However, it didn't stop them from being Marxists ideologically, and I imagine with such people, the feeling of extra persecution for their beliefs translated into a new form of oppression that they got to tout, and thus they started raising their kids to be what they call red diaper babies, and also they latched on to various civil rights movements to spread their Marxist beliefs, such as ending Jim Crow for Black Americans and the women's movement. From what I've gathered, the white dude bro communists of the 1960s and beyond largely latched onto various anti-war campaigns to push their anti-capitalist agenda, attempting to convince everybody that there's essentially been never a single valid reason for American military intervention ever, aside from maybe fighting Hitler, and they did so by focusing exclusively on war stuff. That left a giant hole in what the white male neo-Marxist types actually did for black people. You see, one thing that I should make explicitly clear is that during the old left Communist Party of the United States period, since the communists could be out in the open and not be persecuted by the government, they actually did successfully manage to do some stuff for the black community. Sure, their ultimate goal was communism, and that's a shame. But it would be a lie to say that they never did a thing that improved the lives of at least a few black people. However, the Communist Party was also historically noted as far back as the 1930s as doing things like going to black community organizing outlets, such as churches and things of that nature, and attempting to recruit members for the Communist Party by joining forces to accomplish a goal that the black leaders wanted to get done, and then attempting to get the black leaders they worked with to be communists with primary allegiances to the Communist Party and not their own communities. Regardless, that stuff is in the history books, and you can read them for yourselves, written by authors that are sympathetic to the United States Communist Party. So don't think for a moment that this stuff is just right-wing conspiracy theorists. I mean, it's a conspiracy theory. No, it's history. It happened. It's not just stuff that right-wing people say about communists to disparage them, because leftist scholars admit to this stuff openly, I've read. Still, what's important to remember is that while the old left was actually uniting as a diverse people to sometimes help the black community, it also died during the 50s, and then eventually the new left sprouted up in the 1960s. But the key difference was this. The new left largely either wouldn't admit that they were communists, not just because of the fear of persecution, but also because everybody was embarrassed by Stalin, or members of the new left legitimately didn't realize that they were Marxists. Because although they were raised by retired members of the Communist Party or the meetings they attended for civil rights were often headed by them, nobody ever really explained where this constant obsession with privilege and oppression actually came from. Thus, like I said, the new left was largely split into three factions. The anti-war people, who got the most attention, but only when there was a war going on, obviously. The women's liberation movement, which gained the most long-lasting traction and even got itself the first women's studies department in 1970. And then the black Marxists, who largely manifested themselves in the Black Panthers, but also in groups like the Philadelphia Cult, which was called MOVE, which was at least vaguely Marxist. There were a few other things, like parts of the gay liberation movement, which were Marxist, and also the Latino Young Lords, but they didn't have a very significant presence. It was mostly just those three groups. But beyond that, my personal speculation is that once Marxists no longer had a grand unifying banner to rally behind like the actual Communist Party, they were largely pretty directionless, and thus, the black identity groups ended up basically wackier and wackier as time went on, growing more and more resentful of their white oppressors, which eventually led to them being black supremacists. And here's the really messed up thing. Aside from churches, I don't see that many community organizing groups for black people that aren't Marxists. It really does seem like they're the only people that provide any specific attention to the black community and the problems that they are facing. Thus, when feminism became the dominant force in neo-Marxism, the black community just suffered and suffered as decades went on, as fatherlessness reached epic levels. Now, this is a super abridged version of some of the stuff that I've learned, and I do want to read more books, but the thing is this. It's this long history of focus on the black community, and seemingly only the black community in regards to racialized Marxist organizing, that has led to this strange way of viewing the world, where they think wacky things like
that race in the United States operates on a spectrum from black to white.
Nobody actually thinks such things besides postmodern neo-Marxists and black people who have been brainwashed by them, and thus, they really don't care about penalizing Asian American students who tried to do the unthinkable and work super hard so that they could get into Ivy League universities. They want crude numeric equality. That's all they want. How dare Asians be qualified and overrepresented? Affirmative action should penalize them, said the neo-Marxists. Also, with that long history of Marxist focus on Black Americans and only Black Americans, is it any wonder why they reclaimed the word colored and applied it to literally any person who isn't white by calling them all people of color? Once they realized it might be a good way to recruit more racial minorities as postmodern neo-Marxists into their organizing. I mean, who needs an ethnic identity when you have a communist utopia, am I right? Totally not erasure at all. Speaking of erasure, it's definitely the postmodern neo-Marxist types who now call themselves simply intersectional feminists that ended up taking it upon themselves to try to completely ravage the Spanish language and use the phrase Latinx to get rid of linguistic gender distinction. Because, forget about brown people, they aren't as important as black people or non-binary femmes or whatever. I mean, you'll have to take my word for it, but when hashtag Native Lives Matter and hashtag Brown Lives Matter sprouted up, there were people in the radical Black Marxist community that accused those groups of being appropriation.
That queer culture has just sort of taken as it will from Black culture without a lot of acknowledgement of Black culture, of it, just completely appropriated from it. And not only without acknowledgement of it, but without even really respect for it. You know, you can have...
Obviously, the point is simple. The left is mind-blowingly racist to literally everybody, including non-black racial minorities that they'll just go ahead and take cheap shots at whenever it's convenient. And the saddest thing is this. While the left attempts to treat the black population as the holiest of holy ethnic deities, maybe next to Islam, their way of worshipping them just means pushing more and more Marxist policies and whack-assed feminism onto them, which is how Obama's city of Chicago ended up the way it did during his administration. You see, Obama's past was in Marxist organizing, and we can safely assume that those types of groups got a lot of funding during his terms, as he was oh so successful, being the first black affirmative action hire as the President of the United States. And now we know how that worked out for everybody. Chicago got pretty bad for a while, thanks in part to Obama and his racism.